Kid tricks. All right, are we live? Fantastic. Welcome everyone to our monthly speaker series. My name is George. I'm usually based in Berlin, but today I'm in San Francisco, which is where we're coming to you live from to hear from Ashley Good, who's going to talk to us a little bit about failure and change and innovation. And I'm super excited about this topic personally. As we are going through today, if you have questions, if you have comments, if you have thoughts, on IRC is the place to go. The channel is Air Mozilla for that. And really dig in, because we're going to hope to make this a bit interactive today. So let me contextualize this a little bit. I think we've heard in a bunch of other speaker series, we've heard during All Hands, we've heard themes over the past couple of years about how Mozilla is both in a rapidly changing world and a rapidly changing sector, and that Mozilla itself is undergoing a lot of change. I think Dave Slater on a previous speaker series, I think it was in August, really put it well. It's everything from the org structure to what our teams do, to our technologies, to our product direction. Everything is constantly changing. And we're also being implored to within that change, innovate and try new things and take risks and really move the organization forward so that we're able to kind of achieve and really test the limits of what Mozilla can do against this massive mission we've set forth for us. And within that context, I think you've heard Mitchell talk a little bit about how we're kind of operating in almost like a new dynamic. She calls it going to space. I think it's a really nice analogy. And she's recently talked about kind of three things along those lines. One is that change is going to be constant. A second is that we need to have a sense of adventure. And the third is that we need to keep moving. And that to me is all kind of bundled up and really kind of connected to the topic today that Ashley's going to talk about. And it's connected because I think to do any of those things well, to manage change, to do innovation, you're naturally going to fail. And it's how we fail that I think allows us to understand whether we can keep moving and whether we can successfully advance and stand up to the immensity of our mission and be great together or not. And I've seen this personally. I've worked with Ashley now for 8 years. Well, roughly known Ashley, I guess, for 8 years. And personally, prior to Mozilla, I was at an organization called Engineers Without Borders, and we did a lot of work with Ashley around pioneering how to fail, how to try new things, how to synthesize those lessons, and how to be really great at failure, which is a funny thing to be great at. But I assure you, you can be great at failure. Now, Ashley has taken this on and been quite ambitious to say, let's see how we can kind of help organizations do this broadly. She, as a regular speaker at a variety of different venues, she works deeply with organizations all around the world in a variety of sectors. And she does all this from an organization called Fail Forward, which you can check out online and search away. So without further ado, Ashley's going to guide us through some great stories, some great thoughts, and have some really practical things to help us as Mozilla get great at failure. So Ashley.
Thanks for the intro, George. Thanks for having me here. So this session is all about, as George said, how do we fail well in practice? There was an article sent out with the introduction or invitation to this session from Chris Argyris called Teaching Smart People How to Learn. Anyone have the chance to read it? All right. For those that didn't, which I assumed was going to be most of you, let me summarize. Chris Argyris argues that smart people are the worst at dealing with failure well. And I start the talk by saying this simply to acknowledge that I absolutely know that everyone in this room and participating with us is a smart person. So yes, that means we are all terrible at dealing with failure well. Yes, that's also why I have a job and why I'm here. My work is to be a full-time failure. I help people deal with failure well. I talk about it all the time. But what I am delivering to you today is actually new. I've never done this before. A bunch of the content's new, and as well as the format, where there's some folks in person, some online, and it's a mix of both a talk and a discussion. So this format's new to me too. And I bring this up not to get your encouragement, or worse, to set the bar low. You have absolutely every right to expect a fantastic session, just like when you put out new products, your users expect excellence. So I point this out simply to bring attention to the messiness of doing something new, where on one hand, on the personal side, like, it's scary standing up here because I don't actually know for certain how this is going to go. And on the organizational side, fail forward will do fine if I mess this up. But if I don't figure out how to deliver new content and constantly change, then my organization becomes obsolete. We lose. We get outcompeted. So I'm stuck with this tension of, on one hand, wanting to stick to what I'm good at and what I already know, but also knowing that I need to continuously push the boundaries, learn, and grow. And then to add to that more messiness is the fact that if this totally flops, and we're hoping it doesn't, but if it does, I have to walk away from this more than okay, because I have to be willing and able, and more than that, excited to actually do this again tomorrow, to get up on another stage and try new content again. And when I talk about dealing with failure well, I'm not just talking about these obvious failures that are more public, that people see, delivering a bad workshop or, a product that isn't landing. I'm also talking about the day-to-day stuff, because I think it's just as or possibly more important to get good at those kinds of failures, because that allows us to build the skills that we need to deal with failure well, so when the more public big failures come along, we have that ability. But what I've found is that this is way easier to say in theory than it is to actually do in practice. You have folks getting up on stages all the time talking about innovation and change, like it's all glamour and fun all the time. And it has been my experience that innovation is only fun if it's what everyone wants and you're good at it right away. And innovation means change, and it has also been my experience that most of the time not everybody wants change, and you are rarely good at it right away. So this is very hard to do, this act of creating something new, constantly adapting, failing, learning as you go. Hard to do, also absolutely essential. I know you know this. I see Mozilla, exploring new products. You're moving on from massive investments in FXOS and a smaller one in WebMaker app, Persona, and shifting away from building and shipping smartphones and to focus on those connected devices. So you're doing this all the time. I know it's not easy. I know even in those few examples, there are a huge diversity of perspectives of what happened, and I'm sure some very, very difficult decisions that had to be made along the way. But as far as I can tell, you guys are in the business of change, of creating new stuff, new products, and moving on from the things that don't work. And how you choose to deal with that is up to you. It's an individual choice, but I see it as a little bit of like a cake or death kind of choice. Like death, you dig your heels in and say, nope, we're just going to stick to the old ways and refuse to try anything new and not adapt. Or cake, you make the tough choice to choose to see the excitement and the possibilities in doing something new, even though it's really hard. Choose to see the excitement in that challenge. So, assuming everyone chooses cake over death, I am going to spend our time together today talking about how to fail well. And I'm going to cover 3 ideas pretty quickly. It's going to be a mixture of theory and examples, plus bringing in discussions from the folks in this room as well as online via IRC. And And then at the end, we'll hopefully have some time to discuss kind of like how do we bring this out of our meeting rooms and back into our day-to-day lives, and hopefully leave some time for questions, any questions that come up along the way as well. So jumping in, first idea is that failure, innovation, and performance are linked. I'm going to kick us off by reading an example from Bales and Orland's book, Art and Fear. And here's the example. It says, a ceramics teacher announced on opening day that he was dividing the class into 2 groups. On the left side of the studio, he said, would be graded solely on the quantity of work they produced. All those on the right side, solely on quality. On the final day of class, he would bring in a scale and weigh the work of the quantity groups, 50 pounds, pots rated an A, 40 pounds a B, so on. For those being graded on quality, however, they only needed to produce 1 pot, albeit a perfect one, to get an A. Come grading time, a curious fact emerged. The works of highest quality were all produced by the group being graded on quantity. It seems that while the quantity group was busily churning out piles of work and learning from their mistakes, the quality group had sat there theorizing about perfection, and in the end had little to show for their efforts than grandiose theories and a pile of dead clay. In the pre-survey for this session, I asked, what does intelligent failure mean to you? And your answers were exceptional. They really said that this group intuitively understands what we mean by intelligent failure and what it means to fail well. There are things like, we go into and come out of the experience intentionally and strategically. We plan to gain something either way. We don't assume the cause or externalize blame. We analyze, learn, and share to prevent future failures, taking the time to rework supporting infrastructure to foster future innovation. This is great because it means that I don't need to spend a lot of time describing this model that's up on the screen in front of you. What I do want to point out, though, is to say that skill of being able to fail, learn from it, and adapt, and so grow stronger and wiser through the experience, is a skill that can be practiced. And as you get good at that, it creates more room for taking risks and innovating, because you know that even the trials that don't work are only going to make you smarter. So my challenge to you, I know you know this, my challenge is to do it, to put it into practice. Because our tendency is going to be to exit. We respond defensively and want to move on as quickly as possible instead of taking the time to learn. Or even when we do take the time to learn, we don't take the time to share that and adapt accordingly. So my challenge to you, put this into practice. And I'm not just talking about the big public failures, but the day-to-day ones too. Whether you send a bad email, miscommunicate with a colleague, procrastinate on something important, take the time to reflect, learn, and adapt accordingly, and that way build the skill to be able to fail intelligently in practice. And I want to put this to you. Failure, learning, innovation, performance, how are they linked in your minds? And specifically, I know that this organization is shifting towards setting very ambitious goals. And that creates room for some level of failure. So in that case, how does that kind of bold ambition setting and that room for failure impact performance in your minds? And feel free to throw up your hands if you happen to be in this room, or through IRC. Diana's monitoring that channel. Any thoughts? Here we go.
Because we're so highly visible, it looks really bad. Wait, you're ready? Because we're so visible, it looks really bad when Mozilla fails in a way that all developers are watching. So we take a lot of risks and experiments, but when we put our name on something, we're really endangering the ideas that we stand for if we fail big.
Ah, interesting. Anything coming through the... Nope. There was... I'll share a little bit about how I see this. Does anyone know how high dive is judged in the Olympics? Okay. You have to execute well. You get points for that. But then that score is multiplied by the degree of difficulty of the dive that you chose. And I think this method of scoring, what that asks of divers, is analogous to what markets are asking of our organizations, where, yes, you need to execute well, but to win, it might require you to choose a dive that's your, flying forward somersault half twist, whatever that dive is. And I think like that 70% or 80% attainment goal is speaks to the degree of difficulty that is appropriate for the organization. So it's asking you to set goals that are hard enough that it's as if on your best day, if you went after that, you would still only be able to nail that dive 7 out of 10 times. And I love that because it really speaks to striving for excellence at every goal that you set. Cool. Any other thoughts on how failure, innovation, and performance are linked before we go on to the second idea? Please.
There's one over here. Yeah.
Let's move. Well, I mean, it feels maybe a bit obvious to say, but it would seem like it would reduce your motivation to take risks, and generally reduce your motivation in general if you feel that you're going to fail from the start. And failing almost most of the way and failing really badly, you probably, if there's no way of achieving it, then your general motivation is going to be decreased.
That's a really interesting point. It's almost like we have to get the degree of difficulty right. Like if you put me up on a high dive and ask me to do any dive, it's going to end badly. I'm not going to want to climb that ladder. But if I know that if I get a shorter board and I know that I can do, a little dive, then I'm willing to try and get better at that. So it's setting something that's within your reach, but still just a little bit outside. So you keep pushing yourself. Thanks for that comment. I am going to move on to the second idea. Good productive failure does exist. Once again, I'm going to assume that you agree with me. I'm going to move on to how, specifically talking about the language and the skills that we need to detect failure early and analyze effectively. So on the language side, we have one word to describe a huge range of experiences. The Harvard professor, Amy Edmondson, she puts these different kinds of failure on a spectrum from blameworthy to praiseworthy. I think the challenge in that is that you can never get everyone to agree where any given failure would fall on that spectrum because everybody has different perspectives, which is great. But I think that it is important to acknowledge we need different tolerances. Obviously, we tolerate failure caused by experimentation much, much more than we would tolerate failure caused by a moral lapse, per se. So a practice that I've seen be really promising for organizations in promoting productive failure is articulating common failure modes and where they sit on that spectrum. So on the blameworthy side, Julie Morath, who leads Hospital Quality Institute, she has 4 behaviors that she has 0 tolerance for. They're always, always blameworthy. Being reckless, knowingly violating standards, working well beyond your boundaries, failure to learn over time. On the other side of that spectrum, this is from a UK-based global retailer, had a handful of examples of failure that were always acceptable. Things like, these productive, praiseworthy failures where the effort involves uncertainty, it's riskier to do nothing at all, assumptions are documented, cost is contained, and we've defined success and it's worth the risk. And perhaps some of these resonate with you. There are, examples that might be appropriate in your context of failures you'd actually want to create space for. I think what's really important here is to articulate and clarify what's blameworthy so that you create room for those productive, praiseworthy failures. So there's a bit of language, nuance around that concept. I'm actually going to ask for George to offer us some Mozilla-based examples. Just shared a little bit of language on what productive failure looks like. I know that Mozilla is doing all sorts of different things and on your team, especially all sorts of different things to bring productive failure into the ways you're working. Specifically, I have a couple of questions that I'll put to you, and then I'd love to open up for discussion. How do you detect early and analyze effectively? And how do you deal with the challenge of adapting your strategy, knowing when to quit, adapt, or persist? I'll leave it to you. Do you want to come up? You can.
Cool. I don't know. Can the camera get me here? Yeah, awesome. Great, I can sit comfortably. So yeah, let me share kind of two things. One is sort of a regular process we have implemented on some of our team on the open innovation and participation team after we do big stuff especially, to really dig in and understand what worked, what didn't, and how might we apply those lessons moving forward. So an example is earlier this year we brought together about 150 of our most active community leaders from around the world to Singapore in a 3-day set of conferences to really align them with Mozilla's new strategy moving forward. And we did a lot right there, and we also did a lot wrong. But what I think was really interesting about some of the stuff that we did right was at the end of the event, we dug in, and both from the participants of the event and also from our own team that was organizing, did a really, really big deep dive on what worked, what didn't, and why. And in particular, we then summarized that into a document of, I think it was our top 8 biggest failures that we had in executing on that event and the follow-up. And then synthesized a set of lessons for each of those failures, and then a set of actions for what we would do to act on those lessons so that we would systematize not making that mistake again in similar activities in the future. And so in that case, that was very much sort of analyzing and understanding the failure. How do we be productive with that? And very much kind of understanding what we would stop do and not do anymore, and how to persist. And that was a pretty heavy lift of a process, and I'm happy to share that document, which is many pages long after this, I think it'll also give everybody a bit of a example of the level of honesty that I think we went into there, which was hard for the people involved when you poured your heart into that activity, being really honest what didn't work and why, and that some individuals that I personally screwed up and others on my team did as well, was hard, but it was really good, and I can capture that. What we've also done is do a bit more of a systematization of this, and I know a lot of teams at Mozilla work on sprints. And I know one of the things we do when we work on sprints is at the end, we're supposed to have this lessons and synthesis time. And so often that gets deprioritized. It's the easiest thing to deprioritize in favor of okay, what's next on our what's in the next sprint, and how do we, manage our backlog and all that type of stuff. Oh yeah, synthesis. We'll get to that maybe next sprint cycle. So being able to protect that time, I think, has been really key for us to really answer that second question around how to quit, adapt, or persist, and to make sure that we take the time to invest in some of that.
Mic's on. There we go. I would really love to open it up to the folks participating remotely, to the folks in this room. How, George provided a great Mozilla-specific example. Have some understanding of sort of the language we want to promote for more productive failures. I'm curious if you have any ideas of things that you can do, and that more with stronger language, things you will do to detect failures early, analyze effectively, and make those hard decisions of when to quit, adapt, or persist.
We have one from IRC.
Go ahead, Diane.
This is a hint to everybody in a room. Get those questions going. We got one through IRC, which is, in a corporate environment, we're graded on our achievements and we're penalized by our failures. We're monetarily incentivized to be conservative towards risk. How can risk be made more acceptable? It's an easy one.
An easy one. I hear it in the language that George uses and George described, was it Mitchell using? So I hear that language being used, which I think is very powerful. That's definitely where it starts. And then I think it's It's specifically people who are in positions of leadership, as in like you manage people, reinforcing those behaviors. So when someone takes a risk and articulates their assumptions and makes sure that that they learn as much as they can from what the pieces that worked and the pieces that didn't, then rewarding that behavior, rewarding for taking that really challenging dive that was just beyond your skill level. Honestly, I think that that's how you create that space. And then I think it's the courage. So that was people in positions of leadership and the people who maybe aren't in those positions of leadership, the courage to try and know that it's worth taking those smart risks so that you learn and improve as you go, is a general answer. George, do you have anything to add to that that's more Mozilla specific?
I
No?
will.
Yeah.
I will attempt an answer, and I will also attempt a comment. So the answer to how will you detect early and often, I guess the first thing that came to my mind is get out of your bubble, right? So too many times we're innovating behind our screen, alone, or with a very small group of people. And the only way to detect failure is to actually test early and test often, and not be afraid to show your work early. And it's required to show your work. And then you'll get feedback. So that's an answer, and a possible answer. A comment on how to compensate against conservative corporate behavior monetarily. I'm not going to go monetarily, but I'm a big fan of, and I'm going to actually, I've been trying to address this with SC, is we should actually give an award for failure on a regular basis. We should actually reverse the stigma of failure into, here's a failure award. There are companies that do this. There are people that try this. And the way it might look is, hey, what was a really, really stupid outcome, even though you had really, really good intentions? Yeah. So, you focus on the intention, and the outcome was this. What did we learn? How can we do it better? So just by making it transparent, it makes everybody more comfortable that we can try more things.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Can I jump in?
Well, actually, contrasting to something I said previously, when we do fail at something, it sometimes does allow other people to pick up the carcass and run with it. So, and I think the thing that is challenging for us is we make incredibly big bets. Like we should go to CES with a TV and commit a lot of units in market. And we have a very big footprint when we do something risky like that. And then someone else takes what we did and then resuscitates it. I heard a very good quote that success is not the opposite of failure, it is the result of failure. The problem is when we make big bets like this and we actually invest in hardware and sending thousands of people around the world to work on this thing, it's very hard for us to pull back, and I'm nervous about the visibility that it creates that, well, gee, if Mozilla couldn't pull it off, then why could I? Because we have a whole bunch of followers who are trying to use what we do as a rinse and repeat model.
That's great, thank you. I also wanted to bring up a couple of things that came through the pre-survey, a couple of ideas, because they relate to what's being said here. There were things, to your point, a couple folks mentioned the need to start small to test and scale up. So you have what a friend called, you have a whole bunch of small F failures so that you never get to that big F failure, and using that mentality to reduce the risk. There was also check your own work from the third perspective often, which spoke to your point as well, and articulate assumptions and use the agile processes of inspect and adapt as well as ideas.
What is the third perspective?
The third, like getting out of your bubble, asking someone who's not involved, getting their feedback early and often, because it's very easy to see things how you see them. It's it's nice to bring in this external perspective.
We have a ton of comments in IRC. I'm going to try to, apparently this is speaking to some people at Mozilla. So we have a lot of comments. I'm going to try to read through a few of them. These were ideas on Mozilla had on how to, whether you know when to quit, persist, or pivot. One was clearly set goals and milestones to help determine if you're, quote, on track. We've set those with our projects. They've done well. Another answer to that is when we've detected something isn't working, but repeated attempts to fix it haven't worked. So those are a couple of ideas on how people know when to quit, persist, or pivot. Someone noted, I'd really like to have a culture that avoids blame as well. If everyone is expected to fail occasionally, that can be a hard cultural shift to achieve. I know I'm giving you a lot. There's one question related to this, so I'm just going to get to that. Let's see here. The question is, how do we fail fast with products without feeling like we're jerking our users around? Making the users learn and use new products, etc., often may be disheartening or annoying to them.
I don't have I might have an unsatisfactory answer to that, but it's the same thing I do whenever I deliver a new session, which was how I started this session, which was, hey guys, like, you're the guinea pigs. That doesn't mean that this shouldn't be great, but if it's not, I need you to tell me right away. And I think the other piece of that is being set up, which is easier in my case than it is in yours, granted, but being set up to adapt to whatever feedback you get as quickly as you can so that your users are seeing their investment in you pay off right away. But I don't think there's any other way around it. Putting out new things is always risky, so, yeah.
Cool. Oh, one more in the room.
Okay.
So to Christopher's big bet conundrum, one way around big bets is to break down the big bet into bite-sized, smaller bets, and then review them early and often, and then course correct as you go. So once you realize you're making a big bet, and the failure on a big bet is really, really expensive or risky, or whatever, it might not even be monetary, break it down, and force the review, and change before you actually get to that big F failure. And even more, make a bunch of small bets that. When I was listening to your question, I was thinking, there's a lot of small bets we make around here too that actually should be a lot bigger. And we're afraid to make those big bets because of those big bets. We have to find this middle ground of, what size bet are we making and how do we stage and gate it? Well, you'll hear us talking about staging and gating investments as we go in the future, and this is what we're talking about.
Thanks so much. I do want to move on to the third idea. So one more idea. Which is that it's really, how we talk about our failures is really important. So I want everyone participating remotely, everyone in the room, kindly think of something you failed at. Don't worry, I won't force you to share it, but I do. The only rules are that it's your failure, something actually like you feel like you could have done better, you messed up, and I recommend a professional failure. We're in a professional context, and I ask you to think of a failure because we're gonna start to work on how we talk about that failure. I also encourage you to think of one that maybe you wouldn't mind sharing, or you think there's some valuable lessons in that failure that you would actually want to share outside of this session. So I'll get you to think of your failures. Take a moment now. Anyone need more time? I'm using this group as my litmus test.
Can I jump in from Toronto?
Where did that come from?
Oh, we have someone in
Toronto.
Toronto. Go for it, Mike.
Oh, hey, Mike.
Hi. Thanks. One of the things that a project of ours that we had of mine, I should say, that I had to shut down recently, was something I've been working on for a while. And when it came time for us to ultimately put more effort, more time, and more resources into to see if we could make it successful, one of the questions that came up was, what does success look like? Like, do we have a clear shared understanding of what the success conditions here are and how we're going to evaluate whether or not we achieve them? And after a long and challenging conversation, what we came to is that we don't have a shared understanding of what success looks like here. We don't know how we're going to achieve it. And in that light, we decided ultimately that we were going to shut that project down. Because if we don't have a shared set of goals or understanding about what success looks like, that is nothing but an opportunity for that project to kind of drift. And so ultimately we closed that down and decided to spend that time and effort on other things.
That's great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing. Everyone else has their failure in mind? Okay. So what I want us to do, and I'm so glad we have an example from Toronto as well to work with. What I want us to do is to reframe our failures as learnings and start to practice telling them in terms of what we learned. And I'm doing think this is a great practice because when we fail, we tend to respond defensively. It triggers a stress response. We want to separate ourselves from the stress response, move on as quickly as possible, and that's why we see all the behaviors that we associate with failures. Ignore, deny, blame, self-criticize, try to fix it before anyone notices, or any other number of defensive reactions that undermine our learning. Reframing our failures as learning helps us to separate ourselves from that experience, look more objectively at it, and also share the information that's really useful to our colleagues. So that's what we're going to practice doing. How I'd like to do that is that I'm going to share my own story of failure, but then I'm going to reframe it for you in terms of that learning so that you know what that sounds like, and then ask you to reflect on what the failure that you thought of and might be willing to share, what that would sound like as a learning as well, based on that example. So jumping into my failure, I launched a website. It was designed as a database to house thousands and thousands of stories of failure and learning. Anyone could submit stories. Never again would a mistake be repeated because this website existed. And I actually pitched it to George at EWB, claiming it would catalyze a new era of collaborative learning. 5.5 years later, there are 32 wonderful stories submitted to that site. So not quite the new era, sorry, George. And 6 months after we launched that site, Engineers Without Borders cut all the funding, and I was left with the very real irony that a website about failure had failed. Ugh. And it shouldn't have been a shock, but it was, and how I talked about that failure reflected that shock, where it wasn't just the project that had failed, but like I had failed. I was a failure. Obviously, that's not useful to anyone talking about my failure like that, which is why I like to practice reframing failures. So that same story reframed as a learning, what I'm going to do is talk about it in terms of the problem I was trying to solve, the effort I put in, and what I learned from that. How am I stronger, wiser, better, smarter because of that experience? So you can listen for those elements. So the problem I was trying to solve, I had a very tough problem. I wanted to share failures and learnings across organizations. As far as I could tell, the only way to do that was on an online platform, so I built a website. Regretfully, very few people actually used the site. What I learned from that experience was that there are a number of people that want to share their failures and learnings, but it's really difficult, takes a lot of time, so you need some sort of incentive and support for those people. The other thing I learned is that many, many, many more people have no desire to share their failures on the internet for everyone to read forever. So I needed to do a better job of understanding my users before jumping to solutions. I took those 2 lessons, applied them to the company I now run called Fail Forward. So there you go, 2 versions, same story. You can see what I did there. I took out that personal, pervasive, permanent aspect by focusing on the problem, the effort, and the learning I put in. I invite you to take a minute or 2 to reflect on your failure and even write down, problem, effort, learning, and articulate the story in terms of that, and take a moment just to think of what that sounds like. All right, anyone want more time? You guys doing okay? Cool. Like I said, I do encourage you to share that story with your colleagues in the spirit of articulating our failures, sharing that learning, and so we grow stronger and wiser through the experience. To be a good listener for those that are going to listen to these stories, remember that it's hard to share a failure story, even if you're sharing it in terms of what you learned. So as a listener, if you ever hear somebody's failure story, I have some ground rules for what it means to be a good listener. Specifically, listen. Seems obvious, not always. Don't judge, don't try to solve it unless they ask. Be supportive and on their team, and recognizing the courage it takes. Being able to share that story takes incredible courage and strength, and just appreciating that. And then asking those so what and now what questions, which is what I'd like to pose to you as another individual reflection exercise, but hopefully something you can bring outside of this session, is once you've articulated that learning and you've put it to somebody else, they have the great opportunity to help you deepen what you can learn from that experience by asking curious questions. Things like, why does this failure matter? Why is it important to share? What will you do differently? How has your understanding changed since this happened? My personal favorite is the last one. How would other characters in this story talk about this failure as a mean to see it from different perspectives? So actually, I'll give you just a few seconds to think, when you think about your failure that you've just reframed, ask yourself some of these questions, anyone that stands out to you, and take a moment just to think about how you might deepen your learning around that experience. So in the pre-survey, we asked, how is failure currently dealt with at Mozilla? And the responses were surprisingly uniform and similar about what you liked and didn't like about how failure is dealt with. On the like side, you saw over and over again people saying, we're good about caring for and redistributing people. That was a clear message that came out. On the don't like side about how failure is currently dealt with, most, if not all, of the responses had some version of, yes, projects get canceled, people get moved, but that learning isn't assessed or communicated. I want to stress how important this is. The fact that those answers were quite uniform to pointing towards that learning not being assessed, I think is really important, and it reflects. I had the opportunity to read the brief that came out summarizing the Hello project, and it reflects what I saw there, where you had this great, honest, straightforward description of what happened with clear decisions that were made, and I think that's amazing, but it did fall short in terms of articulating what was learned, what was great, like what worked really well, what didn't work really well, how were those decisions made, what did we learn through that process, and communicating that widely. And so I want to put that to you. How do you feel? Sure, you reflect for yourself, how is failure currently dealt with, but also, and possibly more importantly, what are you going to do about the fact that nobody's really happy about the level of assessment or communication that's happening? What can you do differently in your day-to-day to assess your own learning and share that? And I'd love to put that question to people in the room, as well as through the IRC if you have comments from remote audiences. No, I'd love for comments from the group, yeah.
Room to start.
Okay, so we now have this process in the product and innovation group of forcing a decision within 1 week. The specific thing, like Mike, I had a project that had a huge external dependency, and it prevented us from getting a web standard out. So what I'm going to have to do, nobody likes to talk about failures when a new idea is coming up. So I want to be part of a sprint process where I say, why might this not work considering some other thing like an external dependency? So instead of talking about, let me tell you about what I failed on, I'll say there may be more of an external dependency in this project than you will need to make it successful. So I'll try to reframe it to not say, this is going to make your project derail, but try to say, you know what, there's something that might be a flaw, and I'm not going to burden it with, oh, hello, tried this and it didn't work, or something like that.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
A couple of comments. This was particularly heartening, so I'm going to read it. One huge thing I've found is that understanding my failures makes me far more empathetic towards others. I kind of should have saved that for last. And then just to encourage you on the, this topic seems to be connecting with folks. Someone mentioned that they're actually writing an email at the moment about a failure, what we've learned from it, and where we're going next. So thanks for this, Ashley.
That's great.
Anyone in the room?
Anyone
Other
we
rooms?
haven't heard from?
Yeah, other offices, more IRC?
Got one more. I love this pillow thing.
So I kind of resonated with the comment earlier about blame. I mean, I think blame is, the way I understand it, it's like a way of discharging kind of shame or pain associated with failure, perhaps. And I was also interested, like, in hearing your advice about how failure is communicated across different levels of the organization. So if maybe there's a failure at, say, in leadership, how should that be communicated down to, like, down the levels or up the levels? Because then there's an imbalance. It sounds like everything we're talking about sounds fine when it's like at the same level, you're talking to your peers, there's like shared learning, but what happens when there's like differences in power?
I acknowledge that power does change the experience of failure, very much so. I think acknowledging that puts even more emphasis on how important it is for leaders to role model the kind of open, honest sharing that they'd want to see in their staff, and be very, start to identify as someone who says openly, you know what, I made a wrong decision. This is this is the analysis I did. These were the consequences. This is what I learned. This is what I feel like would be useful to other folks in similar situations. And this is how we're going to do better going forward, as a kind of structure for thinking about it. I think when we think about our failures, we can only get so deep into our own learning by ourselves. We almost have to share it. So I think it's appropriate to share with a few folks first and get them to ask you those curious questions to help you deepen your learning. Is this a part of any trends? Like, what can we do differently? But then I think the most important piece in that, especially for leaders sharing down, is to role model that openness and to reward those who have the courage to do so that they're managing. That would be my quick answer to that. I've asked a couple of times what you're going to do throughout this talk/discussion. And I don't want to leave you with a sense that you have to do all the things, because I know that never works, as we already have very long to-do lists. So I actually want to put it to you to close out this session to think of just one thing that, based on this discussion and thoughts that you've had lately, one thing you will do differently. I have a list of generic examples of things you can do, thinking about core values, putting in rapid feedback loops to get the information that you need, promoting psychological safety on your team. Perhaps it means decide what you're going to stop doing so that you have time to learn and reflect. But I'd love to put it to George to see if you have any comments that you might want to add to this list. And then I want everyone in the room, everyone participating, watching online, think of one thing that you will do different starting this afternoon, and commit to doing that. But George, Mozilla examples?
Awesome. Yeah, awesome. So more specifically, Ashley sort of said, hey, George, you need to make a commitment in front of everybody on what you're going to do over this next year on this topic. So I'm going to do that right now. So my commitment to both myself and my team is that for every experiment that we run, which we're setting up to do lots of in 2017, we're going to very clearly establish hypotheses upfront and checkpoints. And I'm going to rigorously kind of hold myself to reflecting on those hypotheses at each of those checkpoints and sharing them not just with my team, but as much as I can within the organization and more broadly within our non-staff cohort of community to be able to invite thoughts and ideas and wisdom that will allow us to move forward more effectively.
Thank you, George. And thanks for letting me put you on the spot to make a commitment in front of your whole organization. I appreciate that. So I put it to you. What are you going to commit to? If you feel like sharing that, please feel free to, or just make the commitment to yourself. Either one's fine.
Okay, a different failure. And this one has to do with the stage upon which the failure happened. And people who were not for the idea had to undermine it through secret, devious means. I'll describe it as that. So I'm going to talk to all the stakeholders before I start to put something on stage. I want to make sure that everyone who might be impacted knows that it's coming before it becomes an email string with a lot of visibility. So I'm going to try to de-escalate and get the feedback before someone has to jump on a string that already has momentum.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Other offices, this office, IRC, what one thing will you do differently? We got something in IRC, something that somebody agreed to this morning, but they'll say again. On their second day of working at Mozilla, they have committed to write the user testing training to teach people how to do user testing so we can learn from our users early and fail fast.
Thank you. I know we only have a few minutes left, and I do want to allow at least a second for questions that come in at the end. But as a few closing thoughts, I've said this before, but I look at failing well, failing intelligently as a skill, and it's a skill that can be practiced, as if you're playing a sport or a musical instrument. You don't walk out of a symphony expecting to be able to play the violin perfectly. You've just seen what's possible, but it's up to you to take the actions and sign up for music lessons and practice your heart away in your basement, learning how to play that violin. So I guess that's why I wanted to close with that commitment to action, that commitment to your first music lesson. And as something to add to that commitment, I have Benjamin Zander here. He's the conductor of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra. He's also an educator, and he has potentially an idea for your first music lesson, your first practice. And I'll just let him speak for himself. And if we could roll the video, that would be great.
The teacher is always right, and the students try to be right. And as one of these ladies said, the best way to be right is not to say anything, then you won't be wrong. Now, I believe the exact opposite, which is you cannot learn anything unless you make a mistake. So I tell my students, when you make a mistake, celebrate. And the way to celebrate is like this. How fascinating! It's actually quite difficult. Try it out on the golf course next time you're out. You know why it's difficult is because when we make a mistake, we tend to pull down, the body pull down. Notice the next time you make a mistake, the body pulls down. Now, instead, when it pulls down, you go, how fascinating. It's like this. It's difficult to do, you know.
I appreciate that. Everyone, I'm looking at all of you, remote and otherwise. I want you to think of your failure. It can be the one you just thought of, but pick one that still has emotional weight, that pulls your shoulders down. But instead of letting our shoulders pull down, on the count of 3, we are all, you people in the back too, all you, remote, I'm watching, we're all gonna throw our arms up and yell, how fascinating. Yeah, and I can understand if you're feeling a little bit like silly or embarrassed. You can close your eyes so no one can see you, but for real, we're gonna do this. I'm gonna do it too, so I want you to think of your failure, really let yourself go back to that moment, remember what it was like. But instead of letting our bodies pull down, on 3, 1, 2, 3. How fascinating! I love this. Okay. Obviously, a very simple action. And I admit a little bit silly, but I love it because it's also just so profound. Like, you just imagine if every time you failed, instead of pointing fingers, blaming, we said to ourselves, how fascinating. What did I learn? And every time our colleagues, our peers, partners failed, we went up to them with that same appreciation and curiosity and said, how fascinating. What did you learn? How much that reshapes our relationship with failure. And with that, I will put it aside, open it up to any questions that are left, and would be happy to hear from the remote groups as well as folks in the room. Yeah.
Yeah.
Considering people are so afraid of the word failure, why did you embrace it in your brand?
It was important to me to use the word failure because it provoked a conversation that wasn't happening already. However, I do understand that in many contexts, it's not the right word to use because it scares people off. And I would never insist that you have to use the word failure if that's not the goal is to foster the conversations and those kind of open, honest conversations that weren't happening. So if using the word failure is going to prevent those, then obviously don't use it. I use it in my branding because it is provocative and intentionally so, to shine a light on a dark side of innovation and that path to success.
One more from the IRC, and then we probably have to wrap. But if you have maybe just one specific tip for overcoming the fear of failure.
I think when I think about the fear of failure, I don't think we're as scared of failing as we are of being seen as a failure by others. And so when I think about that fear of failure, to me it's about acknowledging that yes, this does take great courage. Yes, this might not work. And deciding for yourself how you stay solid in your decision, whether it turns out to be the right one or wrong one, you're taking that risk knowingly that it is a risk, so that if you are seen as a failure by others, you have that strength in yourself to say, you know what, I went in prepared to learn either way, and I'm going to share that learning so that you actually that you harness that learning potential of the failure either way. But I think it is, and a part of that is probably articulating as you take that risk, look guys, we know this is a risk. If you have ideas for how to mitigate that risk, let me know now. So that you're bringing people along in that adventure. Yeah. Cool. That's a great question.
Yeah, thank you. George, wrap us up. Yeah.
Thank you so much, guys. It was such a pleasure to be here.
You can stay up here. Quick thank you to Ashley. That was fantastic, super engaging as usual. And we have a gift of Firefox for you. That is the physical manifestation of the browser. Thanks for joining us and sharing your thoughts and wisdom on that great session. That was super interactive as well. So.
Cheers, George. Always a pleasure.
Thanks everyone for joining in.
in.